Okay. Well, I'll get started with some housekeeping while we allow more folks to enter the room with us. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. The structure of this event will first be introductions, then a program with Carrie Ishee, and lastly, some time to take questions and comments. If you have any technical difficulties, feel free to write it in the chat box and I'll assist you there. To ask a question or make a comment, you can raise your hand to be unmuted, or you can type it in the Q&A or the chat box and I'll read your question or comment for you at the appropriate time. Start with an introduction. Carrie Ishee is a widely respected art therapist and life coach, as well as a teacher specializing in the issues of ethics, self-care, and boundaries for mental health professionals. Carrie Ishee's experience of healing from the soul-shattering trauma is documented in her award-winning memoir, Seduced Into Darkness, Transcending My Psychiatrist Sexual Abuse. Her book won first place in the 2021 New Mexico Press Women Communications Contest for Best Memoir, and first place in the 2021 National Federation of Press Women Communications Contest for Best Memoir. Relying on her journals she began keeping at age 21, it took nearly 4 decades for Carrie to write her story. She needed time to understand what had happened to her, heal her soul of the trauma, shake off the shame of ever being so vulnerable, and claim her voice as one who can inspire others on underworld journeys. Please welcome Carrie Ishee.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you for the folks that are here live today and anyone watching after the fact on YouTube. I just appreciate the courage and the compassion it takes to witness journeys that often start very dark but become transformational. And it's always interesting to me to see who's drawn to this subject, to this material. And I wanted just to read a quote that I just came across from Thomas Merton, who we know is a 20th century Trappist monk, writer, theologian, mystic, poet, and activist. And I think this speaks to the power of sharing this kind of information. It is in the nature of things to be drawn to the very experiences that will spoil our innocence, transform our lives, and give us necessary complexity and depth. So thank you, Thomas Merton. I certainly feel like my journey brought me to a place of depth. And I was just sharing with my husband this morning that whenever I prepare for one of these talks, I reconnect with that sense of depth and connection and meaning and purpose. And it's always powerful to be re-engaged, both telling my story, but also just sharing hope and healing for the masses. We all need healing. And it's a time where there's a lot of abuse of power that's really coming to the forefront. And the desire for people to heal from experiences of trauma is really more in the collective consciousness than ever before. So I think it's an exciting time. I wanted to thank Santa Fe Public Library, Jessica, and my husband, Chris Ishee, who's here, for all of his love and moral support through the years as I've shared this story. So I wanted to share that this tale, and here's my book, Seduced Into Darkness. It is published locally here by Terra Nova Books. And I went with the local publisher because after sending out initial manuscripts just to the unknown internet and not always hearing back and not knowing if I heard from people, I wanted to sit with someone for coffee and talk about my project. And that happened with Marty Gerber at Terra Nova Books. So I appreciate the opportunity to publish through them. Again, this journey started when I was 21. I just turned 62. So there's been a huge arc, a process of coming to healing, coming to understand what took place. And I always felt that I had this story in me to share with the public because of what I witnessed on the journey. I've had to grow into talking about this. It was published March 1st, 2020. And of course, the whole world shut down on the 15th of March. And so my book launches, which were all scheduled for that spring, got canceled. And when I finally had a launch, it was on Zoom with my wiener dog in my lap and my husband in the next room and sitting among the comfort of my home. And it felt like such a relief because even though I feel very healed and have a wonderful life now, sharing a vulnerable story like this and shaking off the shame is a continual process. So I wanted to say too that when I share my story now, I often don't cry when I'm telling it, but when I read from the book, I often feel overcome again, sort of like I drop into the eyes or behind the eyes of that 21-year-old Carrie, and I'm often really touched by the emotions that are still present. So don't feel like you need to take care of me. Don't worry about me. It's just part of my journey. So I've been happy that my book has been well received. I've received some awards, but really happy too that the profession is starting to recognize it. And there's some psychologists out there that are using my book in training and my story in training, because ultimately we want to make our profession, we want to clean up our profession and keep practitioners well and healed so they don't exploit their patients. So I'm going to read for a while and then talk a little bit more, and then we'll have questions. So I share this book as a prayer for the healing of our humanity, facing our shadows, challenging abuses of power, and embracing our healing personally and collectively is the path to a more conscious, loving, and compassionate world. And I think, again, facing the shadow head on. We're seeing this happen worldwide now. So this is the preface. This is a story of innocence, a story of abduction, a story of innocence lost. It's a story of soul death, of darkness, and of rescue. It's the story of hope, of growth, of divine purpose, and of transformation. It's a story that begins with an attempt to end my life. Though most of this book takes place in a small American town in the 1980s, it is also a story as old as time. It's the story of Persephone. Greek myth tells us that Persephone was a young maiden picking flowers in a springtime meadow when the earth rent in two, darkness flooded the light, and Hades, god of the underworld, and her uncle forcibly dragged her into his lair, a place darker than she had ever known, holding her captive and forcing her into an incestuous relationship with him. Above ground, the earth turned cold. Persephone's horrified parents, Zeus and Demeter, searched for her to no avail until their divine guide, Hecate, walker between the worlds, told them where fair Persephone had gone. They rescued her, but not before Hades had tricked Persephone into eating the seeds of a blood-red pomegranate from the land that held her. In doing so, she ate the most abundant seed-filled fruit on earth, which fortified her with life while also binding her to return to the land of the dead for a time, year after year. But now, not as a naive girl, but as a wise woman and goddess, confident in the knowledge she's strong enough to descend, return, and descend again, no longer bound to the will of her captor. It is a myth that embodies the dark journey of someone who not only survives the horror of her abduction, but also transcends it. Decades after my own abduction, I was both compelled and intimidated by the idea of writing a book about it. Seeking clarity, I made an appointment with Santa Fe psychotherapist, evolutionary astrologer, and mythology expert, Jason Hawley. Together, we sat down and pondered my birth chart, my life's direction. Thoughtfully, he declared, "Yours is the story of Persephone." In that moment, the air crackled around us, and I knew we had identified the ancient archetype whose journey clarified my own. From then on, each time I sat down to write this story, I first closed my eyes and called upon her. "Help me," I'd ask. "Strengthen me," I'd ask. "Speak to me, Persephone." Well, I told you the tears would come. It's still powerful for me. But what I had originally wanted to name the book Speak to Me, Persephone, and my publisher talked me out of it because he thought I needed to share something that was a little bit more obvious about the content. But it's in my heart, it still Speak to Me, Persephone. So what happened for me was I was in between the junior and senior year of college. I was at Virginia Tech and I was studying biology and psychology and was getting ready to launch into adulthood, thinking maybe I would go to medical school, maybe I would be a therapist, a physical therapist. I was really searching. And around that time, the spring before my senior year, I started having these symptoms that were very disturbing, like my brain got very foggy. I was chronic sinusitis, my energy was low. And then soon after, I started having deep depression and panic attacks. And I had never had psychiatric symptoms other than, mood swing, little anxiety here and there, but this was like full on. And there were other things that had happened that were triggers for kind of a crisis for me, but physiologically, I was not well. And I went to see a counselor who sent me to a psychiatrist to look at about meds. Well, within about 5-10 minutes, he diagnosed me as manic depressive, which when I look back feels absurd. Because I was highly anxious and talking really fast. And I was having these kind of spiritual experiences of connection with God. I mean, it was like this real crisis I was in. And I called my parents and they said, absolutely do not let them put you on lithium. Come home. We're going to get some consultations for you. Hang on until Christmas. So I got home at Christmas time. I saw 3 different doctors. And we landed on the last one, the third one, because he's a Georgetown educated, very well-respected doctor, referred by a family friend, practiced close to where I grew up. And the other ones were more like an hour away in DC. And so we felt good about this decision for me to see him. So I had seen him a few times, and now I'm going to read from where he asked my parents to come in for a consultation to come up with the treatment plan. Again, I'm just turned 21. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Tansey, I strongly feel that Carrie needs intensive psychotherapy, he said with utter authority and confidence, and she should take a break from college. Healing needs to be her top priority right now. The 3 of us sat there stunned. Leave college with only 6 months until graduation? Can't a pill lift me out of this, or some good psychotherapy? I sat like a flower frozen by a sudden springtime snow. Dr. Romano continued. I changed his name, by the way. I think Carrie is in a significant emotional crisis. Dad struggled to keep his voice calm. Doctor, do you think she's manic depressive and needs lithium like the other doctor suggested? No, I don't think she's manic depressive. I think Carrie has an agitated depression, but she's not psychotic, nor does she have a thought disorder of any kind. Thought disorder. The words reverberated in my foggy brain. Lately, my thoughts had certainly seemed disordered to me, but I was relieved by his diagnosis. Phew, I thought I was effed up, but now I know I'm not that effed up. Dad continued to probe about my future. Doctor, how long do you think this will take? Dr. Romano estimated that I would need 2 to 3 years of intensive psychotherapy 2 to 3 times a week. Carrie is very smart and insightful, a good candidate for insight-oriented psychotherapy, Dr. Romano continued. I rather she not be on medication so she can do the deep emotional work she needs to recover. Insight-oriented psychotherapy. Carrie is smart, insightful. I let these encouraging words linger in my mind. I sat up straighter, and somewhere beneath the layers of fetid fog inside me, a tiny voice said, yes, Carrie, you are. Well, does that mean we have to go get her stuff from campus? Suddenly, Dad looked older. There was something in his face I'd never seen before. Defeat. Vulnerability. Please tell us what to do, Doctor. My suggestion is that Carrie put her healing first in line, Dr. Romano said. Is it all right if she lives at home for a while before she gets her own place or returns to college? My own place? Plans were being made without me. I could barely get up in the morning, let alone get my own place. I was relieved to hear my parents say, yes, she can live at home. Everyone stood up and Dad reached out his hand. Very good, Dr. Romano. This sounds like a good plan. Don't let her get away with anything. Be direct. I like the no medicine policy. Let's all pray that Carrie can find her way through this. Yes, Dr. Romano, Mom smiled politely. Thank you. She had no questions, or if she did, she didn't reveal them. I wondered if she had an opinion of her own. Carrie will see you in the car, Dad added. They closed the door with hopeful smiles. I sat alone on the couch, feeling like a dissected frog in biology class. Oh, ick, I thought. Look what's inside this thing. So, Carrie, how do you feel about the plan? Dr. Romano asked. I was silent. 2 to 3 years of intensive psychotherapy felt like a mandatory sentence in addition to a very long probationary period. I wondered about living with my parents again. I imagined getting my things from college and the humiliation of not finishing when I was so close. I dreaded the possibility of running into Louis, my old boyfriend, especially at a time like this. I was ashamed I couldn't take care of myself. I also think, Dr. Romano's voice pierced my ruminations, we need to take a look at how uncomfortable you are with your sexuality. I was back in the room and suddenly felt naked. What? I asked. I think therapy can also help address your discomfort with your sexuality. Had I heard him correctly? Discomfort with my sexuality? I let the words sink in. He had waited until my parents were out of the room to spring this one on me. I was afraid to ask him what he meant by that. After all, he was the professional. I had enough to think about. Leaving college, making healing my priority, moving back home, and now there was this discomfort with my sexuality. That last one hadn't even been on my list of worries. While mom and dad waited in the car, Dr. Romano and I scheduled more appointments beginning next week. On the way home, dad was turning the wheel with one hand, relaxed. I like him, Carrie. I think he won't let you get away with anything. He's wise, seasoned, smart. I say yes to the plan. I'd ignored putting on my seatbelt and leaned forward, poking my head between my parents' seats. I tried to sound casual, but the words caught a bit in my throat. He says, he thinks I'm uncomfortable with my sexuality. There was no response from mom and dad. The rest of our drive was quiet, except for the squeegee crunch of packed snow beneath the car tires. Now, as a therapist, when I look back and think about how he was already setting himself up as the expert, giving me the recommendation, pulling me out of school, making therapy my priority, which in some ways might not have been inappropriate, but I didn't bring up any issues around my sexuality. It was 1980. What I knew about Freudian therapy or psychoanalysis at the time was that often there was something around repressed sexual urges. I mean, I wasn't sure. It was like all intellectual. So when I shared this with my parents, I don't remember completely, but I think I was like, is this okay? And they didn't say anything. And they might have thought that they were uncomfortable with their own sexuality. Who knows what was going on in their heads? But it was like from the very beginning, there was this crossing of boundaries and making my healing be orchestrated by him. So that continues, sadly, throughout. One of the things, I'm going to read a few more passages, was that I was going through this spiritual awakening. I'd been raised Catholic. And when I was starting to struggle, I got very interested in the search for God. Is there a higher power? Is there a larger picture? And I tapped into the wisdom of my Catholic upbringing to connect with the sense of God I was raised with. And so I had been attending prayer meetings and reading the Bible. And I was having these profound experiences of light and connection, offset by panic and depression. And so I was having this kind of split between, is this a spiritual crisis? Is this emotional crisis? And again, I'm 21, I'd never been in therapy before. And he was expressing fascination by what I was saying and wanted to hear more. And at one point in time, about 5 months into therapy, and again, I'm seeing him like 3 times a week. So I'd been seeing him a lot and was really getting very connected to him and to the therapeutic process and really intrigued by this deep inner journey. And we were going down to withdraw me from college, my dad and I, and he canceled an appointment with me, which was unusual. And when we were driving back, and I was full of shame, I didn't want to have to withdraw from college, but I was on this path of healing. So as we were driving back, I'm just going to start reading from what happened when I was down there on campus and driving back. On campus, I muddled my way through the task of getting my things, seeing old friends, wishing them well, and trying to mean it. On the drive home, our trusty green station wagon was saddled with my stuff. My Eagles and Fleetwood Mac records, my sewing machine, my diaries and photo albums, all those biology and psychology textbooks. I gazed out the window as the sun started to set over the Virginia countryside. Then, as we passed the exit to Luray Caverns, Tony, who is my doctor, I'm calling him Tony by now, came to my mind in a powerfully visceral way. It was like the stories you hear of mothers somehow knowing that their children are in danger. I sensed Tony was in serious trouble and found myself compelled to pray intensely for him, sending him light and love. I knew in my deepest being that he was in some sort of crisis. The next day, I arrived at Tony's office to find him radiant. He sat me down and told me he had something important to say. I noticed that his face was relaxed, almost incandescent. I had a crisis this weekend, Carrie. Sometimes I suffer from intense chronic pain due to a condition called trigeminal neuralgia, an inflammation of the fifth cranial nerve, and I have to take Tegretol whenever I have a flare-up. I woke in the middle of the night feeling toxic, like I was going to die.
I asked my fiance for help, but she rolled over and went to sleep, apparently disinterested. It was at that point that I said, I surrender, Lord, take me. All of a sudden, a light appeared in the room. He went on. I let go and all the pain left me. Instantly, I said to myself, this must be what Carrie is talking about. I went back to sleep and awoke with a deep sense of joy and peace with no pain. I could barely contain myself. I had to let him know about my premonition. I've been praying for you that day. I felt something was terribly wrong. I knew it, he said with the enthusiasm of someone who had just tapped into the wisdom of the universe. He leapt out of his chair and clasped his hands over his heart as if in prayer. I just knew it. Time stood still. We both sat in his office, basking in the feeling that God had indeed touched him and that my prayers and intuition had been the conduit. I realized I might have something valuable to offer the world. What if I'm some kind of healer? What if I can bring him to God? And this is the reason we've met. Deep inside me, the voice that came to me at age 5 spoke to me again. Everything that happens in your life happens for a reason. You are not alone. What if leaving college and starting psychotherapy wasn't indicative of my personal weakness, but part of a greater plan? Tony seemed happier, lighter, and now he finally understood the reality of my spiritual experience. It made me trust him that much more. When our session time was up, he asked me to come back later that night to finish our talk. After dinner, I put on my white gauze pants, a striped t-shirt, and tree-torn tennis shoes, and wrapped a casual sweatshirt around my waist. I slipped out of the house telling my parents I wanted to take a stroll around the neighborhood to see who was playing tennis, but I walked the mile to Tony's office instead. Even though the clouds were shrouding the stars, it was a beautiful night. He met me at the door and I took my usual seat on the couch. Sitting cross-legged, I was all ears. God had truly touched him. Then out of nowhere, a jolt of skepticism penetrated my spiritual high. Is this session for him or for me? I wondered if he was billing my parents for this secret time between the two of us. Carrie, I don't know what's happening, he said. I think about you day and night. I want what you have. I want a little piece of you every day. Seeing his eyes light up that way and all the tension drain from his face made me feel enormously expansive and grateful just to be alive. I could tell that he was talking about finding a larger purpose for himself and a real connection with God. Something was happening here that felt risky and exciting. It felt so gratifying to lead someone to their own greater truth. But what did he mean? A little piece of me? I'm sure he meant a little piece of God. So at this point, I'm just going to read one more passage. Let's see, time-wise. Yeah, this will take about 5-10 minutes. At this point, there was this feeling of like, oh my gosh, this split I had inside between what was spiritual and what was psychological, emotional was starting to come together. I could talk to my doctor about these experiences. He was having one. But again, not knowing that it started becoming so much about him and his quest instead of mine. So at one point in time, this was probably maybe a month later or so, this experience happens. Day by day, I was experiencing more emotional breakthroughs, growing stronger and feeling more confident about my future. Some mornings I'd wake up and not even notice the depression. I was aware, however, of the elephant in the room. I could tell Tony longed for more than friendship. But how could I walk away from the mentor and doctor who had brought me this far? He was like a second father, a father I could tell anything to. The moment arrived when I knew I had to just get it out in the open. I couldn't bear to upset him, but I didn't want to lead him on and ruin our special bond. One day in session, I brought it up. I have something I need to say. I nervously glanced down at my hands. It feels like I have this barrier keeping us from going any deeper. I slid my hands down an invisible wall that seemed to separate us. Back then, I didn't realize those were my boundaries. What do you think it is? He asked. I was shocked by what came out of my mouth next. I'm afraid I'm falling in love with you. He scooted to the edge of his chair. Have you ever stopped to think that maybe I'm in love with you too? His eyes brightened. Well, that's it. We can start planning to do things together. You can come to the farm. We can do things around DC on the weekends. I'd love to take you to the opera. This is just great. I sat there in stunned silence. I had just said, I'm afraid I'm falling in love with you. Emphasis on the word afraid. As he continued talking, he was oblivious He'd just broken up with his fiance, and now he was acting like a kid in the candy shop who had permission to grab whatever he wanted. Did he break up with her because of me? Suddenly, I sensed a ball of light quivering in my belly, and I felt it leave my body and rush into his. Paralysis swept over me as if I'd been gotten hit with a blow dart big enough to stun a rhinoceros. What just happened? How do I get my sense of self back? Now that I had named my fear, the barrier between us seemed to dissolve, but so did my sense of being separate from him and what he wanted. The room started spinning like a top, and I could feel myself floating out of my body. I was losing it. Wait, I silently screamed. Wait. I thought I could say anything in therapy and we'd explore it together. I thought we were here to examine our feelings, not act on them. I didn't mean it. I didn't know how to say, I'm afraid you are falling in love with me. Wait. Wait. From my studies in school, I knew some fundamentals of psychotherapy, including that it's common for patients to feel as if they're falling in love with their therapists. But instead, what they're really experiencing is transference. I was confused about my feelings and wonder if I was experiencing transference too. I wanted to talk about this with Tony, not become his girlfriend, but he was so happy, so excited. I couldn't bear the thought of letting him down. That day, as I left the building, I was nauseous and my whole body felt as heavy as lead. I could sense him back in his office, jumping up and down with delight. I walked slowly under the weight of dread and a deep sense of foreboding. I was finally getting better, and now this. This wasn't what I wanted. I only wanted to heal and move on. That night at dinner, I sat like a mannequin. My family was so used to my mood swings, no one even asked me what was wrong. The wheels of my mind were spinning as I considered what to do. I had to take it back. I'd call him and tell him he'd misunderstood me. After everyone went to bed, I quietly made my way to the basement to use the phone. I couldn't think, let alone sleep. I had to get this cleared up. Tony answered with a warm, dreamy voice. Oh, it's you. I took a deep breath and blurted out, I think you misunderstood me. I think maybe I shouldn't have said that. I love you. I really love you. I don't, however, want that kind of relationship with you. I just want to explore my concern that we're getting too close. His warm tone instantly cooled. He became authoritative. What? I can't believe I'm hearing you say this. What happened? How did you change your feelings so fast? You know that's impossible, don't you? We have to talk about this tomorrow in person. He ended the call abruptly. That morning, I dragged myself to his office building, terrified of what might happen. I had to resolve this. I needed to salvage my therapy, our friendship, my health. My hand was shaking as it slid up the stair rail. At the top of the stairs, a woman was waiting for me. It was his daughter, Mary Catherine, who sometimes did office work for him. I don't know what's wrong with Dad. He's so upset. He's in pain and still sleeping. Because his farm was about 60 miles away, he often stayed in the office on weekends. I'll try to wake him, she said with concern and a hint of curiosity. I went in the office and took my usual seat on the couch. My body was bristling. I knew what was wrong with him, and I hated him for it. Part of me was worried, and the other part felt completely manipulated. This was supposed to be my therapy, my healing. Eventually, Tony shuffled in and limped over to his chair. He looked like a devastated man. What happened, Carrie? You know that it's impossible for your feelings to shift that fast. I'm wondering if this is your fear of intimacy revealing itself. I felt my resolve crumbling. Now that we were face to face, I couldn't think of what to say next. I wanted to take it back, but what if he was right? Oh God, I guess I'm really effed up. I must be in love with him because he's in love with me, right? I loved my doctor and wanted to protect him, but I didn't want a romantic relationship with him. I just wanted him to keep being my doctor, my friend. He was clearly suffering, and it was all my fault. What I really meant to say was, I'm afraid you're falling in love with me and we need to talk about it. So why didn't I say that before? Why couldn't I say that now? I sat there paralyzed. I just wanted things to be the way they'd been before. I was willing to say anything to regain the peace between us. I decided to save Tony's feelings by lying about my own. Well, I think I'm feeling that way again. Tony smiled. He took a deep breath.
So that was just one example of the kind of gaslighting manipulation that took place when I was trying to sort through what was going on in the room between he and I. And it continued. This went on. I wound up being in a relationship with him for 3.5 years total from the first time I saw him as my doctor. And sadly, it took me being in a place where I just felt like I was going to go entirely crazy if I stayed with him. And I was starting to really question him. And in the beginning, I just felt I couldn't stand the thought of having to leave college again. By that time, I was finishing my degree and letting my parents know, ruining his reputation. And later on, I went to graduate school with his son, who was in my class of 11 students in clinical psychology doctoral program. And I couldn't imagine sharing there what was going on, or the whole secret would blow up. And of course, at that age, 21, 22, 23, I had no idea the damage of keeping such a secret. And at times I still felt like God was intervening, and maybe I have to settle for this. Maybe this is love. I was just all mixed up. So you got a flavor for my book. I do wind up sadly attempting suicide twice, wound up in a hospital and was transferred to another one for long term because I was in such at risk to myself. I was completely confused about what was real. Once it started becoming sexual, it got very, very dark, and he involved drugs in the situation. And I just had so much shame and so much confusion, was so desperately hanging on to what had been good before and wanting to get through and finish school and then graduate school. And did wind up taking him to court as encouraged by the hospital team. And there was a lot of media attention, front page newspaper attention back in the 80s. And then eventually national attention too. CBS News, Dan Rather did my story as I was moving to Santa Fe. None of this I wanted, none of this publicity, but it was, I really didn't have anything else to lose, quite frankly. And I by this time I had found out he had done it again. Immediately after my court case was over, he started slowly crossing boundaries with another client and got involved with her. So long story short, there's a lot involved in this, but you might see the art behind me. I became an art therapist. So I had started out in clinical psychology training, but when I was in the hospital, it was creating images from my unconscious, from my psyche. Jung speaks that the psyche, or Jung quoted that the psyche speaks more powerfully in images and words. And as I started purging all this stuff that was inside me and coming back to my truth, I was able to really see that it wasn't that I was hopelessly messed up, but that I had been psychologically manipulated, gaslighted, and abused. And that's why I wound up where I did. So quite a story. It took me a long time before I wanted to get back into the field, but I kept getting called back into it. I was an interior decorator, and people would tell me about their broken marriages when they were trying to look at drapes and all these, instances where it was like, I just had this larger call for healing. So anyway, I'm now an art therapist, a clinical counselor, and a life coach. And I feel very inspired by the potential to heal and transform trauma. And I'm a mental health advocate, and really want to empower people on the journey of knowing their inner truth. So much of our training is about following the leader, following the expert. And it's always so important to come back to our own truth and our own intuitive process. So that's where we are. I'm actually in the process of writing a second book now that's a guide for people going through dark underworld journeys. Just as Persephone, the goddess Persephone, that archetype, that she becomes the queen of the underworld and the goddess of spring, helping to activate renewals, the rebirth after a dark winter. All of us can have that psyche, that can have that archetype within our psyche, and can come back to a place of renewal and healing. So thank you for listening. And does anybody have any questions? There's a lot to go through.
It was a lot, but you're so brave. Clearly such a strong, wonderful being. And thank you so much for sharing this. I know it isn't easy. If anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to type it in the chat or Q&A box. I could read them for you. You're also welcome to raise your hand to be unmuted. So you're already working on a second book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had always wanted to do that. And quite frankly, I really needed to, as much as I was already a licensed therapist and had a very full practice and felt really good about my professional identity, it was birthing this book. It was like this needed to come out first before I could then also claim what were the practices I found to be really essential in coming back from such a devastating, shattering loss and trauma. And so that's, it's like this one is birthing a lot easier. It's a lot easier to write. I'm able to stay in my 62-year-old psyche instead of my 21-year-old self. But I've been really touched by the interest, and I'm really enjoying speaking to people. I'm hoping at some point maybe I'll be speaking to young women in colleges, just in terms of power abuse and how to find their own internal authority, and just how the reality is the psychological and the spiritual really cannot be separated. When you're going through a really hard journey, finding your spirit, and that doesn't mean it has to be an external sense of God. Perhaps it's just collective, connecting to the collective or to nature. It's essential. And if you really want to live a beautiful life, an engaged life. So, yeah.
Brianna wrote in a question, and I had a similar one, because I know that you encourage art therapy, and of course writing is an art form, so maybe trauma writing. Brianna wrote in, can you speak to some of your healing journey and what helped you to recover?
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for that question. Again, the breakthrough for me in the hospital was when I did that one image that sadly I don't have now. I need to be able to share that on the screen, but it was a very powerful image of like a shattering and really hacksawed penis phallic shaped images coming into this dark void. And it was like all the denial and the rationalization and all this gaslighting just dropped. And I saw what really had happened to me. And I knew I was not in that shape when I went to see him. I had never had any psychiatric issue, but the truth of the matter is this can happen to people even more easily if you have had hardcore childhood trauma. Like, that's why the profession has to be clean and clear, and professionals need to be keeping the boundaries for the healing. But the art, just monsters would come for me. I mean, really hideous blobs of gook and yuck, like literally coming out of me onto the paper. I'm also a singer, so eventually I started singing again. And I have a great story here so the hospital that I was transferred to is Shepherd Pratt in Baltimore, Maryland, which is really a world-class hospital. And back in those days, there weren't residential treatment programs. So I was locked up in a hospital, and I was fortunate in many ways that we had good insurance. Many people go through this stuff and they don't have resources, which is devastating. Another reason why I've written this book. But anyway, we used to go out on these, we felt like I felt so pathetic. Here I am going on these field trips with all my cronies from the psych hospital, and we'd go down to the Inner Harbor in Baltimore, and we were just like all of us were just devastated by experience. These were amazing people that had hardcore trauma, right? So that was another eye-opening thing to witness who was in the hospitals. Were really beautiful souls that had been wounded. But anyway, years later, I wound up singing in a small band, and we went down there to the harbor, and we would play at the harbor. So that was so victorious. It was like, I'm back. So art, music, the writing was very, very powerful. When I started writing, it was 2011. I had been writing on and off for years, but when I started writing, someone says they read my book. Oh, I'll have to look at it. I'd like to hear from that person. But anyway, let me see. I lost my train of thought. What was I saying?
Singing and art as therapy.
Okay, writing. I had been writing it for decades, but it was not until our daughter was 11 and starting to get a life outside of the home where I actually had time to really sit down and write. And the first draft I wrote in 4 months. I mean, it just poured out. And then it took a lot of years to sculpt and resculpt, and so that it was that I felt good about it, that it was beautiful, and that it wasn't just coming from this victimized wretched state, but that I was coming with a place of awareness and consciousness so that it could be offering hope. Yeah, the writing was so powerful. And I mean, that might be something eventually I do, is lead some workshops on writing too, because it was so important. And then I would also say sharing it has been so important. As the more, I didn't even realize that I still had as much unprocessed grief as I did until I started writing and sharing. And as you saw, I started crying again. I don't know if I'll ever not cry when I read parts of my book, because I'm so like, how in the world did I get through that, you know? But anyway, it's been quite the process. So I recommend everybody, you know, write, do music, do art. What we know about trauma is it's the right brain modalities that take us out of the linear mind, that analyzes, that thinks above and below. It's kind of like our egoic mind is more in the left brain. That's a simplification, but the right brain is much more connected to the somatic, creative, spiritual self. And so the more we can access that and speak from that place, the more we access healing energies. And which I think is also spirit, you know, and what I would say one of the most exciting things about my journey is just really learning about, you know, becoming the internal authority as opposed to the external authority. Many of us were raised at a time when Father knows best. You know, the power is outside of you, it's male, you follow the rules. And we're at a very different time in society now. And I think we're ready for and hungry for a more embodied spirituality, which includes the body, includes the emotions. It's not just in head and the belief. And I found that firsthand from going through the trauma, that it wasn't, you know, just going to church and praying, as beautiful as that could be, and that's not to diss that, was not enough to heal. I had to get this stuff out of my body. And I think in doing that, and one of the things, and you might see the art behind me, I still do images from my body. So I'll go in, and I do this regularly with clients, go in and see where the sensation is I'm feeling. And it might be opening and expansive, or it might be very contracted, or anger, or whatever. I'll go in and I'll express from that place. And then that's just giving it room. Like these things that happen to us, they just need to be seen and given some air. And if we can do that with ourselves first, great. Journaling is great too, but then also sharing it in a group in some way, having witnesses is so important. So I hope that answered somebody's question. I wanted to go back to
definitely. Yeah, let me read Jerry's. Yeah, you did answer that. I think that's great advice. Jerry writes, I have read your book and loved it. Can you talk a bit about how you found that it was actually a hormonal or some such issue that brought you to these feelings of depression when you were in college?
Wow, thank you. That's so great. And if I was to do a new edition, I probably would highlight that aspect more, because that was really big. Basically, what it was is candida. So I was on antibiotics for 4 years straight, tetracycline, and as an adolescent, starting at age 17, I got a later in adolescent case of acne. And it was back in the days where they gave tetracycline out like candy, you know, it's like, here, take this. Well, now we know that that is incredibly disruptive to your biology in your intestines, right? And in fact, that's where the neurotransmitter, or serotonin, has neurotransmitter sites there. And so that gets disrupted. So candida, a deep case of candida can wreck your health and your emotional health. So that was an underlying, that's part of why I think that I was just kind of dissolving and was so easy to be manipulated, because I didn't know what was wrong with me. It took years until that was diagnosed. So it was very easy to take on his interpretation of what was wrong with me. And it really was, he was looking for what was wrong with me, not what was right with me. But at the same time that he's trying to be in this relationship with me, he asked me to marry him. And it was just weird. It was so many levels of wrongness about it. Right. And I think that he was a very deeply troubled man. And sadly, when I went before the ethics committee, because again, it became all, public information in the newspapers, I went to the licensing board, and he was, and at that point I handed over the documents, like, you guys decide. I don't want anything else to do with this. Please decide for me. I just had gone through too much. And I didn't even know, at that point, I didn't know he had done it again, or he was in the process of doing it again. And so they slapped his wrist for 6 months, mandatory supervision. He continued to practice, 3 offices. He basically was not affected other than emotionally, but when I later actually wound up connecting with the husband of the woman that was being abused, there was this whole set of synchronicities where I found out about her. I mean, it was really that's where sort of the God thing connected. Synchronicities was very interesting, because very unlikely I would wind up talking to the husband of the woman that was, then involved. And, he had heard all these stories about me that just made it look like I was just this terrible gold digger, and he had loved me and all that. And he had put me through medical school. I mean, this whole story, right? He deeply narcissistic, really sociopathic, really making up these stories. And then I told the husband what had happened. He didn't know I'd been in a hospital. He didn't know I attempted suicide. He didn't, and so then we tried to go back and reopen the case. It was at that point where we were told that no, she needed to file the complaint, which was wrong. And we were confused, but it was, back in the 80s, you didn't question authority as much as you do now. Now I would be much more persistent. Certainly at this age, I'd be way more persistent about that. But we were told that she needed to file the complaint. And we're like, well, how can she if she's still under his spell? And so, but around that time, I got asked to testify before the Maryland General Assembly for a task force we were looking to form to study this issue of doctors that were exploiting their patients. And it was through that testimony and the sort of the publicity around that CBS News then found out about my story and asked if I would speak about it. So it was a dubious, I didn't really want to be known for this, right? But it was like, well, it happened. They're asking me, I want to make something good of this. And I have had people contact me because they've heard about my book, and I'm really happy to support them and steer them in the direction of resources, and all of which I'm still really just compiling myself because it's a changing landscape. Back in Maryland in 1984, when I filed suit, it was not a crime. So it was a civil suit, and that was geared towards paying my medical bills. I had lots and lots of medical bills and lots of future therapy I had to do. But now it is, here in New Mexico, it is a crime. And I just looked online and saw that now in Maryland it is too. So there's half of the states it's a crime. And part of why I think there's been some resistance to criminalizing it, and it's very complex, is that if someone is going through this and they realize if they file a complaint that their doctor may not just lose his license or her license, it's usually male, female, but sometimes it's female on female, all different combinations. Not only could they lose their license, they could also go to jail. When you've been in what I would call, they call it professional incest, basically. It's like an incestuous relationship where you had these good feelings about this person and then these confusing, weird, abusive experiences. It's very hard to have the clarity to want to take action and hold them accountable, period. And then when you also know that it's a crime. So on the one hand, that's really important to say, this is how damaging this is. We know the Hippocratic Oath has been around for 2,500 years. Doctors do no harm to your patients. We know that it's in every ethical code, but it does continue to happen. And sadly, the fallout is predominantly on the patient. And very often a doctor who has had this kind of transgression, it's often multiple instances, not always. And they're not all necessarily predators. Sometimes they're late in life, going through a divorce, a financial crisis, and they've lost their own center. So that's part of my message too, is about, what is it? Physician, heal thyself, right? Healer, heal thyself. So, yeah.
Thank you. You're so brave.
Well, I also just kind of want to throw out, like, this is an inverted universe we live in. Like, how shamed victims of sexual assault or incest or abuse, how shamed they get for the symptoms they're showing when the symptoms are showing the damage that happened to them, but it gets inverted. So I'm just speaking out against shame and like helping people shed shame, because that keeps us small, it keeps us disempowered. And then we don't take action against the people that really need to be held accountable and out of power. Because there's so many good doctors, there's so many good therapists out there, and we want to elevate the profession. So, Yeah.
Definitely. Carolyn writes, thank you, Carrie, for sharing your story with so much vulnerability. What did you find most useful in taking care of yourself while writing this book? I was curious too, how do you take care of your heart, Carrie, when you're
Wow.
writing and thinking about such painful things? How do you
Oh my
take care of
gosh.
yourself?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think trusting creativity, which is creativity is a process of engaging unconsciousness, darkness. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know where this is going, to like staying with it. And then something starts to take form. Like understanding the creative process is also to me like understanding emotional healing, which is that these dark, difficult places inside need expression. And ideally, you're doing it therapeutically. You're not acting it out against your partner, against your boss, against which, is a lot of what happens in the world. We have these wounds that are untreated and unconscious, and then they get played out again and again. So, what I did to take care of, first of all, I did a lot of journaling, every day journaling. I let myself weep and weep and weep and really come to fully embrace that tears are medicine. And we know that even by research that they help release endorphins and oxytocin. So it's like this whole thing about don't cry when we are constantly bombarded with really terrible stuff. It's sort of like we have to find our places to cry, right? It's not always safe, but like, oh my gosh, like weeping and getting really comfortable with weeping, quite frankly. And then a lot of art. And, I've got a wonderful husband and a beautiful daughter and lovely friends. And I've really healed my relationship with my own family of origin, which he really did everything he could to estrange me from them and make them like, oh, they're one of the sickest families he's ever seen. I mean, it was just BS because it was not true. He was one of the sickest people I've ever encountered, but he was projecting that on to all these other people around me to isolate me. Classic predatory moves, grooming moves, right? So, but I think the other piece for me is that I always had this deep sense of call, like I've got to do something beautiful with this. I cannot let this die with me in a hospital. I mean, once I survived the suicide attempts, which were scary and serious, once I survived them and found myself kind of in this observer mode, going through this, this is so crazy. Like, oh, I've got to make some meaning from this. Viktor Frankl's book, I don't know if people are aware of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. He writes about his experience in the concentration camps and how he describes that, once everything has been taken away from you, the only thing that someone cannot take away from you is what you're going to do with it, how you're going to respond. And so when I read that book in the hospital, first of all, it was sitting right next to, in the library in the psych hospital, right next to Freud. And I'm like, Freud, bad worldview, not aspirational, right? Like where's the healing with that? And again, not to say that there cannot be healing from people trained in psychoanalysis. I don't mean that. But if you look at the worldview, Viktor Frankl had gone through one of the darkest chapters in history and came out really wanting to make his life better, bring meaning to his life. So finding inspired stories of people that had survived terrible things in life really made me go, okay, if he did it, I can do it. And so, and you know, Jessica, from working with books, right? There's so many wonderful inspirational tales out there. So yeah.
You'll be one to inspire others that you did it. They can do it too. Holly wrote, love you, my friend, and so proud of you. Wondering how your husband has supported you in your healing.
Well, Chris could probably chime in on that. Hi, Holly. Holly is one of my dearest friends from high school, which is, this Zoom thing is so cool because Holly lives in Texas and here she is. So thank you, Holly. Gosh, my poor husband, Chris. Well, first of all, my husband, Chris, is a jazz musician. So he understands art and darkness and light and being lost and then finding the way and all that. So there's something intuitive that he just understood, I think, when he met me. He actually came into my life just as CBS News was contacting me to do my story. So he was performing in Vegas at the time. And I remember driving down the strip and telling him, oh, by the way, I'm going to be on national television next month. And he's like, what? And so he heard from early on that, whoa, okay, well, I'm really signing up for something big with this person, right? But I think, Chris was just so willing to work with me, where when I was in those fearful pockets of like, can I trust again? And by that time when I met him, I was trusting myself more, but I didn't necessarily trust men. And so he just was willing to be in conversation with me about the fears that came up. And so, and with generosity and compassion. So there really are good guys out there. I'm very grateful for mine. And I think he was not somebody that was interested in having control and power over me. And I think that was, my story was so much about my power being taken away that we really could be equals on a creative journey together. So it's made a big difference. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And your husband just put an emoji in there with big heart eyes. For those of you who can't see the chat, it's been supportive since before this program started. He's in another room watching this. Yeah, so you have a great support system, it sounds like, and you've really come into this woman of strength and healing, and you're healing others. Very inspiring, and very courageous, and I thank you a million times for sharing this, and obviously can be painful too, but it's very appreciated. So thank you for sharing with your community far and wide, and thank you all for being here for this important event.
Thank you, all of you. Blessings.
Yeah, everyone check out carrieishee.com. You can find more information about Carrie and her books there. And be sure to check out the Santa Fe Public Library calendar for more of our upcoming events. And stay safe, read books, read Carrie's book. Carrie, you take care, and I look forward to hearing about your next book and works of art.
Sounds great. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you all. Have a good rest of your weekend, everyone.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.